Hello and good evening, everyone. I'm Sophia Toma Cruz, Rappler reporter covering the Department of Foreign Affairs, and we're here right now in Puerto Princesa in Palawan, covering the visit of United States Vice President Kamala Harris to the island. So tonight, I'm just going to give you a quick recap, well, hopefully a very quick, concise recap of what exactly happened during U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris's visit, not just to Palawan but to the Philippines. For those of you who may have missed it, VP Harris was here for a 3-day official visit. It was the highest so far by a U.S. official under the Marcos administration, and also the highest. I think, if I'm not mistaken, she was also the highest ranking leader to visit the Philippines so far under Marcos. Both when you look at the relationship of the Philippines and the U.S., it was significant, and also just by her mere rank alone, she's so from been the most important guest for the Marcos administration. Um, so just a quick overview of some of the things that she did while she was here in the country. The main events included, she first arrived Sunday night, on November 20, coming, and she flew in from Bangkok, where she attended the APEC forum, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, where she really made a pitch. Where she sought to send the message that the U.S. was a better partner for countries here in the Indo-Pacific. And that comes in a better partner in terms of a wide array of aspects like energy, economic, finance, and every boosting countries' economies, and also responding to some security threats in the region. Although APEC is really a forum that's more focused on the economic realm, and actually our reporter Bea Kupin covered that event. Read her stories and watch her recaps as well for what happened there and some of the deals that were reached. But again, a quick recap of what Harris did when she was here in the Philippines. So after arriving on Sundays, her schedule was really packed. It was a 3-day visit, but uh, there was no time wasted, I suppose. The main events on Monday included a bilateral meeting with President Marcos and also a meeting with Vice President Sara Duterte. She also met and had a conversation with activists on human rights and democracy in particular. And she also had a quick moderated town hall with young women on the issue of gender equality and women's empowerment. And that was a first of its kind for the vice president during a foreign trip abroad. So she has talked a lot about women's empowerment. In fact, it's one of her personal advocacies. But then a senior official from the US mentioned that this is the first time that Harris had a sort of public interaction about the issue with an audience, where she took questions and answers from them. And so a little interesting bit there, she expressed solidarity with human rights defenders here in the country. And of course, that was significant coming from the US's second most powerful leader and also the most powerful female leader in America, because human rights here in the Philippines have been under attack and have really been um, sort of vilified under the administration of former President Rodrigo Duterte. So she also brought up the issue of human rights, press freedom in her meetings with Vice President Sara Duterte and with President Marcos. Um, uh, that was interesting to note as well, of course, because of the contacts coming up from the last 6 years, and also because of the current human rights record that the current administration was still left to grapple with coming off of the last 6 years. Before she left for the U.S. today, she also had a brief stopover in Palawan, and this is one of the main highlights of her trip, because she left the capital Manila for a tour in a community of a local fishing community here in Palawan, in Tagburas village. And she also capped off her trip with a speech on board the Philippine Coast Guard's BRP Teresa Magbanwa. It's one of the two largest ships and of the PCG, and it's often used for patrols as well in the West Philippine Sea and in responding to any emergency or crisis there, because the PCG, as we know, is the country's first responders, usually in when it comes to these incidents. So let's talk a little bit about the outcomes of the trip. There were at least 20 new initiatives that were launched in line with Harris's visit here to the Philippines. And this spanned from new dialogue on certain issues being open, also additional funding for um, both security and livelihood programs, and also new programs itself that were announced in a wide array of areas, which include climate change, the shift to clean energy, infrastructure, agriculture, food insecurity, upskilling, and also human rights, health, and maritime security. So it was really a wide array of um, uh, issues and sectors covered. And I mentioned this in a previous Rappler Recap, if you tuned into that, when State Secretary Blinken visited the Philippines for a 1 day trip, is that you kind of saw, or we're being reminded again with the new administration, um, just how extensive ties between the Philippines and US are. It's pretty unique to both the Philippines and the US, and that's also because of the really long history that the two countries have shared with one another. So we'll talk a little bit about those deals later. Um, Actually, I think we can mention some key deals, because I mentioned there were at least 20 new initiatives, and so I'm just gonna point out for you some of the key efforts that were created or at least launched during this trip of VP Harris to the Philippines. So first would be the a high level policy dialogue on energy, and that's important because the Philippines, of course, is facing an impending energy crisis, where um, there is an issue of energy security as well, and how much energy the country will need in the coming years, and balancing that along dwindling supply. There's also a launch of negotiations on civil nuclear cooperation agreement. It's also known as a 123 agreement in the U.S. And what that basically seeks to achieve is that, well, once those negotiations are closed and a final deal is reached, um, there will be legal basis for the U.S. to export nuclear equipment to the Philippines, and that will allow the Philippines to start hopefully using, or at the very least exploring, nuclear energy. It's a very, very pricey um, form of energy, but it's clean, and it's something that not only Marcos but Duterte had wanted to do as well. So our business reporter Ralph Rivas has a really comprehensive report on that. I suggest that you read it. Um, Aside from that, we also have there was also the announcement of the development of a nickel and cobalt facility. What would that be for? Um, well, it's important for the transition to clean energy and the use of clean energy technology, because refined nickel and cobalt are essential minerals for that, exactly, for clean energy. And the development of a facility that refines those two minerals is aimed at increasing production to around 20,000 tons. And so we see here that the Philippines is going to play a part um, in the US's effort to um, foster the use of clean energy technology, both here and abroad as well. And then there's also the opening of a U.S. Trade Development Agency office in the U.S. Embassy in Manila, and I think that's one of the concrete deliverables coming off of the bilateral meeting between President Marcos and President Joe Biden on the silence of the UN General Assembly, because the two had talked a lot about increasing investments here. Marcos also met with a lot of U.S. Businesses and U.S. companies, U.S. businessmen who expressed interest in investing in the Philippines. And so having a trade and development agency office open in the U.S. Embassy is aimed at of kind of building a pipeline of projects where the USTDA will be helping companies who are interested in investing in the Philippines actually close deals and see those SC investments actually coming into the country. And then there's also a food security dialogue that was launched, a high level one that will involve senior officials from relevant agencies. And there's also an eyed partnership with Now Telecom for 5G technology here in the country. There's also the announcement of the launch of a project to have satellite broadband structure with SpaceX and Starlink. And then also a possible funding of $8 million for the health system, the Philippine health system in particular, and another $7.5 million to strengthen maritime law agencies. Again, there's oh sorry, I missed out on one. There's also before Harris left the country, she also announced that the Philippines was now receiving near real-time data on maritime areas under a Quad initiative. So the Quad is a partnership between U.S., Japan, um, Australia, and and India. Um, and then, of course, there's also the announcement of additional funding for EDCA to complete projects that were already on the way. Um, and I'll talk a little bit about that later as well. But maybe moving on a little bit to some key takeaways from from the visit of VP Harris here to the Philippines. So a lot of observers and analysts are seeing Harris's visit as marking a sort of new phase in ties between both the Philippines and the U.S. And you can look at this. I think we can look at this in two ways. First would be um, post Duterte. It's just a marked turnaround between how both sides are interacting with one another. It's just been the first few months under Marcos, but the level of engagement is at a pace that we haven't seen in years, and that's not just because of the pandemic, but also because of if you go back to how Duterte was and how he felt about the U.S., he never hid his disdain for Washington, and he even went as far as to declare an economic and military separation from the U.S., which is the Philippines' oldest ally, and he did that in China, no less. We also know, of course, that that they wanted really prioritize fostering closer ties with China, and lately these days, there is a lot of increased competition between the U.S. and China. So coming off of that, you can just see how how Harris's visit here is also marking a new phase. Of course, Duterte also threatened a lot of military deals like the VFA, which he threatened to terminate and then actually terminated, and then later on walked that back and restored the deal. And then EDCA, like I mentioned a while ago, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. Projects are finally starting again after being stalled under the administration of Duterte. Um, so those are some of the, I guess that's one aspect of the context we're coming from when we say that there's a new phase in ties between the Philippines and the U.S. Post Duterte, Marcos is now opening the door again for stronger relations with the Philippines' longtime ally. And when we look at Marcos himself, also there's a aspect of his personal history coming into play. It's not just a new phase in Philippine US ties, but it's also a new phase for the Marcos family and the US in particular, because the two share personal history, close history. Um, in EDSA, for instance, during the EDSA revolution in the late 80s, of course, President President Marcos's father, Ferdinand Marcos, was ousted from Malacanang, and the U.S. facilitated his and his family's exile in Hawaii. So it's a very interesting relationship to watch, because on the one hand you have that rocky past, but then also you have when you look at President Marcos's history, his personal history, there's also a lot of fondness for the U.S. because, or nostalgia as well, because it's a sentimental place for him when he visited New York. Philippine ambassador to the U.S. Jose Manuel Romualdez mentioned that it was a special place for Marcos, also because that's where he met his wife, Lisa Araneta Marcos. Marcos also has a standing contempt order in the US, but then while he's in office as a head of state, he will enjoy immunity from that. Um, and I think another recurring theme that we saw during the Harris visit was something we first saw back also when Blinken visited Manila in August, and that was really so during the Blinken visit, and also which was followed by the bilateral with Joe Biden on the sidelines of the U.S. General Assembly, and now Harris visiting the Philippines. That the U.S. really is eager and willing to work with Marcos, who has spoken very fondly also of the U.S. So we can play. There was an interesting bit Marcos mentioned during his meeting with Harris. This is something he mentioned as well in New York, but he reiterated it when he welcomed Harris to Malacanang, and we'll play that back for you. It should be about now.
Happy. As you know, and that has been is really well established for very many years. The relationship between our two countries is something that we both our countries have really come to depend upon.
Yes.
And with the more the upheavals that we are seeing, especially in the not only in the region, but especially in the region, these partnerships become even more important. The situation is rapidly changing. We must evolve to be properly responsive to that situation. And so that is why it is very important that we continue to progress, that we continue to strengthen, and as we redefine those relationships. So your visit is a very strong symbol that these relationships remain strong, and that these relationships remain important, as indeed they do. So that is the Filipino. I have said many times, I do not see a future for the Philippines that does not include the United States. And that really has come from the very long relationship that we have had with the U.S. and the continuing to and of course we went through different phases of relationship, but as since the war, it has just been strengthened in every way.
Yes.
In the economic sense, in the political sense, defense, security. I cannot think of an area where we have not cooperated, collaborated, and have had good results for both our countries.
Thank
Yeah, so that was a pretty interesting clip, and in particular, the last few sentences that Marcus mentioned about when he reiterated that he and Filipinos can't imagine a future for the Philippines without the U.S., and also that the relationship is um, growing even more critical because of well, everything that's happening in the region. When you have tensions in Taiwan, you have missile launches from North Korea, you have the South China Sea dispute, and a whole other host of issues. So um, I think we're also really seeing here that apart from the new phase, when you compare it to post Duterte and you compare it to Marcos's own personal history, the new phase is also really being ushered a lot by just the landscape right now, and both countries are seeing that they really need one another. Um, uh, they really need one another to respond to the growing threats and growing challenges here in the region. And I think another aside from that, another key takeaway from the trip was when we can look at what the trip was supposed to achieve. It was supposed to strengthen security ties and deepen economic ties. So by those measures, in a way, in most respects it met its purpose. So when we look at the security aspect, we saw um, there were hopes, expectations that new funding or sites would be announced under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, or EDCA, and that's a key military deal that allows the U.S. to access select bases in the Philippines. Um, Access so they can pre-position assets for any emergencies and also for humanitarian response. And But then Harris capped off her trip with without mentioning a lot of details on, or at least her office as well, not mentioning a lot of details on EDCA. We do know that there is additional funding for that. Coming off of some $80 million that was already given to complete the project. So there will be additional funding on top of that. But then on this, when we ask for concrete numbers or figures and just how much exactly the additional funding will be, what that might look like, there are not much details yet on that issue. And also um, there were questions over whether or not new EDCA locations might be announced during the trip, but that didn't happen as well. And the agreement is particularly important for um, the Philippines' response, well, the Philippines and the US's response to threats I mentioned a while ago, like tensions in Taiwan. So the announcement of new locations is something that we're looking at, and a lot of people are speculating that maybe it could include a sited northern Luzon, which northernmost part is just separated by a by the Bashi Channel, which is 200 miles separate Taiwan and the Philippines, and that's the Bashi Channel on the northernmost part of Luzon. So another issue that we'll be keeping close watch of. Um, Still on the security front, while there were those expectations for EDCA, a lot of the strengthening was in the messages that Harris gave while she was here. During her meeting with Marcos, she reiterated a message that we've heard a lot from U.S. officials in the past. But it's a relatively new message if you consider the fact that the U.S. and the Philippines have had the alliance for 75 years and have had a mutual defense treaty which sees both sides to commit one another to commit to defend each other in case of an attack for around 70 years. And that message, of course, is that the U.S. will defend the Philippines in case of an armed attack in the South China Sea. So we can play. Um, we'll play for you a clip of what Harris said when she met with Marcos, reiterating that message.
Relationship is based on mutual concerns about security for the region. We are both proud members of the Indo-Pacific, and in particular, as it relates to the Philippines, I will say that we must reiterate always that we stand with you in defense of international rules and norms as it relates to the South China Sea. An armed attack on the Philippines' armed forces, public vessels, or aircraft in the South China Sea would invoke U.S. mutual defense commitments. And that is an unwavering commitment that we have to the Philippines.
Right. So that was the message that she delivered to Marcos, and that was also the same message that she delivered in Palawan. The difference is that, well, exactly that, the place where she delivered it. While she did it, while she gave the reiteration to Marcos, she also made a point to mention that in Palawan, and that matters because Palawan is the island in the Philippines that faces the West Philippine Sea, and so residents there really pay witness to effects of the of the country's maritime dispute with China. Um, and Let's play a brief clip for you as well of what President Harris said on board the BRP Teresa Magbanwa. It was a little bit of a more personal speech. There was a personal tone to it, but the message was also that.
And the broader international community have a profound stake in the future of this region. America's prosperity relies on the billions of dollars that flow through these waters every day. And we are proud to work with you in your mission. As an ally, the United States stands with the Philippines in the face of intimidation and coercion in the South China Sea. As the United States has long made clear, we support the 2016 ruling of the UN Arbitral Tribunal, which delivered a unanimous and final decision firmly rejecting China's expansive South China Sea maritime claims. The tribunal's decision is legally binding and must be respected. We will continue to rally our allies and partners against unlawful and irresponsible behavior. When the international rules-based order is threatened somewhere, it is threatened everywhere. So the rules and norms that I have discussed today, they matter to the United States, to the Philippines, and to communities around the world. So to all of you here today, I say, the United States-Philippines alliance is strong. We are committed to you. We are committed to your success and to all the lives and livelihoods that rely on your work.
Right there. So you heard what VP Harris said, and just to unpack a little bit, it was a little bit of a long set of remarks, but then essentially what she was saying was that like what she told Marcos, the U.S. will defend the Philippines in the West Philippine Sea. Also, that the U.S. reiterated that it was supportive of the Philippines' legal victory against China, which China, of course, continues to ignore. And she called on China to abide by the ruling, which was what she mentioned. The words that she used was unanimous and legally binding. Aside from the trip, also, so in that way, it was really the messaging and the symbolism of where she was that strengthened, in a way, ties between the U.S. and the Philippines when it comes to security. But aside from the trip, there's also a lot of work going on among diplomats and defense officials because after strategic dialogue last November 2021, both sides agreed to come up with defense guidelines on the mutual defense treaty. So it really essentially ironing out or answering questions that have come up over the last few years, how to respond to newer threats, and just bringing the 70-year-old treaty to a more current form and allowing it to be more responsive to, well, the 21st century, because it was almost a century ago when that treaty was signed. And lastly, on the economic front, this is also where bigger achievements, or at least more concrete achievements, we're seeing. A lot of the new initiatives I mentioned a while ago, like the energy dialogue, the food security dialogue, the new the trade agency office opening, and also additional funding. A lot of that is related to the economic cooperation between the two countries. And this is a really key area because, well, Philippine ambassador to the U.S., Babe Romualdez, mentioned that President Marcos made it clear that one of his main objectives is to bring economic prosperity to the country. And economic diplomacy in particular is going to be a cornerstone of his administration's policy plans for the next 6 years. So on that front, it's also the economic aspect is also where President Marcos really wanted to see more growth. In the earlier days of his presidency, he was saying that he wanted more trade, not just aid from the U.S. And so we'll keep tabs on that because, like I mentioned, it's still early days. So we'll wait to see exactly how much will come from those deals, whether or not will be closed, and what exactly they might look like. Um, I'll stop here. We'll still have a lot of stories to help you unpack the trip and what that means, and where this is all headed. But for now, join us again next time. For now, join us again next time when we recap more special coverages for you here on Rappler Recap. Again, I'm Sophie Toma Cruz, and see you again next time.